Next on our plate, when you were listening to me talk about William Faulkner, did you wish that it was shorter? Do you wish that it was shorter and more intense? Well, I got one for you.
Oh, God.
1937, contract with MGM. F. Scott Fitzgerald, another great novelist.
The Great Gatsby?
The Great Gatsby himself. Stopped in Hollywood, and it was horrible. This is F. Scott Fitzgerald on California. I hate the place with sincere hatred. It would all be inconvenient in every way, and I should consider it only as an extreme measure. Which it was. His life back in the East and the South during 1935 to 1936 was really terrible. His short time in Hollywood kind of revitalized him here and there, which started, like I said, 1937 and went pretty much to the end of his life, but that didn't mean that he had no troubles whatsoever. Just to give you some context, his first novel, which was This Side of Paradise, which pushed him into like an overnight success, was written in 1920. The wealth he gained from this secured Zelda Fitzgerald, who's his renowned crazy wife.
World-renowned lunatic.
With the finances he got from his first novel, he was able to secure her hand in marriage, which she was unable to. He couldn't put a ring on it unless he had some money. A year later, he wrote The Beautiful and the Damned, another Fitzgerald masterpiece that was published in 1925. The Great Gatsby is published. And although it wasn't an immediate success, it became his landmark piece and established him as the voice of the jazz age, 1925.
And the voice of 10th grade. 10th grade English class.
Still haven't read it.
You really not read it?
No, I never read it.
Interesting.
I read a lot of his short stories. I never read any of his novels, though.
It's the same.
I can never make it past the first chapter because I don't know who they're talking about.
The Great Gatsby.
I need to know who that is first.
It's Leonardo DiCaprio doing hip-hop shoes.
I thought it was Robert Redford. During his successes, he had two very brief professional visits to Los Angeles as a screenwriter. His first visit to our city was in 1927, working on an original screenplay that he had written titled Lipstick. A year earlier, upon returning from France after 2.5 years with Zelda, United Artists turned to the Fitzgeralds, after all, Zelda was a writer too, to write a flapper movie for Hollywood that was going to star Constance Talmadge. Since Scott needed the money, he gambled on a part payment deal, which was $3,500 upon completion of Lipstick against $12,000 if it was accepted, with the presumption that it would take all of 3 weeks to complete, because he's that good. Zelda and Scott were in Hollywood from January to March of 1927, living like a bunch of flappers in a town that rewarded indulgence. He put his screenplay on the back burner, and of course it was rejected in April, and they returned to the East Coast. Bunch of failures, a bunch of drunk failures. He came back 4 years later, 1931, to work on a script for MGM's Red-Headed Woman, starring Jean Harlow, who would go on to haunt, along with her husband Paul Byrne, the house where Sharon Tate would have the premonition of the murder that she would be the star of.
Refer to episode Monsters.
But Scott didn't handle this assignment very well either. Although the film was produced, his heavy drinking took a toll on his ability, and he didn't really contribute much to it. The credit for the writing went to Anita Luce, who was a pretty famous screenwriter, who said that he tried to turn the, quote, silly book into a tone poem, which, all right, you give him some credit. He's really good.
A tone poem?
Tone poem. Like a poem of tone. Oh. The excessive drinking and the social lifestyle of the Fitzgeralds was beginning to mutate for the worse. Over the next, if you're going to mutate, it's going to be for the worse. Over the next 40 years, he slowly and mercilessly starts drowning himself in alcohol, while Zelda has breakdown after breakdown, moving from institution to institution.
God.
And
in LA or?
No, on the East Coast.
Okay.
I'm just setting it up, how bad it is. In 1934, Tender is the Night is published, and it sells about 13,000 copies. Hollywood,
good?
I think it was average.
How many people were in the country back then?
12,000. So everybody got a copy. Everybody got
1.3 copies for everybody.
Hollywood was interested in making Tender is the Night into a movie. RKO had serious interest in it, hoping that it could feature Katharine Hepburn, and it would require some changes to the story, which Fitzgerald didn't like.
Let me pause for a second. Hubba hubba. Go on.
But nothing developed from that. No Hepburn for you. And in 1935, Goldwyn Studios went a step further, drawing up treatment for it, which they invited Fitzgerald over to the West Coast to rework. But again, nothing came into fruition for that. So here we are in 1935. He hadn't written anything of renown in several years, and for the first time in a very long time, editors were starting to turn his work away, which he didn't like. He felt like his ability to write had vanished after years of kicking his brain cells in the teeth, which, sure. He was turning into a solitary drunk, which would often lead to the DTs.
What is that?
The delirium tremens.
Okay.
Is that, yeah. All of his DTs would require hospitalization, which of course would cost money. Zelda is now in the Highlands Sanitarium in North Carolina, which of course costs money.
Oh, God.
They presume that she was going to be there for the rest of her life, so sucks. In 1936, he tries to commit suicide after the New York Post reported to him that on his 40th birthday that he was just a ruined man. Like, they posted this entire article that he's drunk and he's manic. Okay, so he tries to kill himself. He managed to get something valuable on the page, however. The autobiographical pieces that were published in Esquire that accumulate to a collection of essays called Crack Up. The Crack Up was about his psychological breakdown, so it's autobiographical.
It's not about his stand-up career?
It was. Psychological breakdown, didn't you hear me? Although at the time they weren't really highly regarded, they showed that he still had some promise left in him. So he was able to leverage his abilities slightly to get a job. Things got really ugly for him in March of 1937 as the stuff he was writing, started regarding it as like half decent, started begging his agents for money, advance me on anything you can. He was panicking about his finances because they were waning, and he was pushing for anything he can get. His literary agent was Harold Ober, who he like turned to for everything, who bailed him out several times. He was like basically his chief financial backer, and he began pushing Fitzgerald to go to Hollywood to be a screenwriter because he said that's probably your best shot for success. They'll pay you. You have a big name. They'll just throw money at you.
You want to be like Faulkner, don't you? Look what happened to him.
Look how happy he is.
Cut to him attempting his own suicide.
Drunk, trying to tie a noose.
A southern noose.
That means it's dipped in a mint julep. Fitzgerald was apprehensive.
Our only cultural touchstone for the South. Mint juleps and plantations.
And the phrase, I say.
And Colonel Sanders' suit. Yeah, that's the South. It's on their flag. A plantation wearing Colonel Sanders' suit. With Foghorn Leghorn leaning on it, drinking a mint julep with a noose around his neck.
Despite Ober pushing him really hard, even though Ober was giving him all the money that he could get him, Fitzgerald was really apprehensive due to his last 2 trips in Hollywood to...
It's a very unfriendly town.
It doesn't churn out novelists really well. He had nothing really nice to say. He was trying to avoid California at all costs. He uses the word hate several times when talking about California. He also claimed in a correspondence with Ober that no single man with a serious literary reputation has made good there. He wasn't entirely wrong. It was already chewing up and spitting out Faulkner around this time. But he was running out of options. He kept wiring Ober for money. Ober had to turn over to literary editor Maxwell Perkins to help keep Fitzgerald afloat. So everyone was trying to keep Scott going, and it was failing. He needed so much money. Just so much money. He had to take care of himself. He had to take care of their daughter Scotty. He had to take care of Zelda. It's May of 1937, and it's been nearly a year since Ober could put a Fitzgerald piece in any magazine, and desperation was really high. His royalty statement from Scribner's from 1936, meaning his total earnings on all his books, which were in print, amounted to $81.18. Double digits. Fitzgerald's mother...
Also a palindrome of money.
Fitzgerald's mother passed away in September of 36, and with that he received a small share of her estate, but it was just a prolonged starvation, just a little bit longer. Ober kept pushing Hollywood, but he continued to resist, which must have really pissed Ober off, because like, the more Fitzgerald resisted, he was just like, I'm not going to go to Hollywood. Can I have money? It was getting harder for Ober on both sides. Fitzgerald was fighting him on one end, and RKO was losing interest in Fitzgerald over his reputation as a fall-down drunk. But Ober had to persist on both sides, and he eventually got the help of MGM's Edwin H. Knopf. Edwin H.
Knopf.
Edwin H. Knopf.
Enough.
That's enough of that.
Enough of this.
He was able to convince the studio boys that Fitzgerald still had some life left in his writing. They were friends. Knopf and Fitzgerald were friends back in France, and he was a really big fan of his. And he had been reading the Crack Up in Esquire, so he knew that they were old friends, still had some fight left in them. So with that confidence that Knopf had in him, he began a very long and drawn-out negotiation to bring F. Scott Fitzgerald on board into MGM. And after a great many delays and postponements, old Fitzy got a contract. And by the way, during the long hiring process, which is described in the book as on again, off again, which means they were like, off again. It shows that Fitzgerald was really, really eager to start working in Hollywood. I guess a little hot rumble, and tell me, makes an old drunk miss it down.
Somebody
like
wanted
this.
to try an oyster cocktail.
June 1937, Knopf goes out to New York, and he signs Fitzgerald up for a standard 6-month contract, $1,000 a week, with an attached renewal option of $1,250 a week for the following year. way more than Faulkner was getting.
Yeah, I think we see who Hollywood values more.
Bring me the young one.
Wyatt Earp.
The fella with the mustache. The one who keeps committing crimes. By train, July 1937, off to Hollywood. Well, Culver City. By most accounts, Fitzgerald seemed really enthusiastic and curious about his new surroundings, unlike Faulkner, who showed up on the scene like, no. Fitzgerald seemed really, really happy to be there. He meets Sheila Graham, who was a British gossip columnist, soon after arriving to Culver City. She first sees him at the Coconut Grove, which was a popular Los Angeles nightclub where celebrities could be seen mingling. It was a ballroom within the Ambassador Hotel, where years later Robert Kennedy would be shot and killed.
Also across the street from the Brown Derby.
Where
fine dining would be shot and killed. Hey, a little commentary from the 30s.
Only 90 years too late. I don't know if it's 90 years. Listen to this in 10 years and it'll be 90 years.
Our episodes age like cheaply made wine.
The cheapest. The book that I was reading refers to Fitzgerald's other biographies that point out how miserable he appeared to be to onlookers, but by a lot of accounts it seemed like the people who were close to him said he was really happy when he got to LA, which is really nice. So Old Sport had to get to work. His views on filmmaking were not optimistic. He felt like the medium was trite and could only convey the most obvious emotion. So get to work.
Tears.
And
the fear of a train coming at you. I give it 10 years. Or my name isn't F. Scott Fitzgerald. And then he shot a Winchester rifle at the feet of Louis B. Mayer. And then he shot Leo the Lion just to show who was king of the jungle now. And then it was him roaring in the logo.
That weak voice of his, that weak doughy face.
Roar.
Roar.
Roar. With his New Hampshire accent. Roar.
What a rube. He didn't really think filmmaking was all that great. He knew that it was just a mechanized system of writing. It was very unnatural. So he had that going against
it's great.
Yes, dude, I love it. He was fiercely opposed to collaborative writing, going back to when he had to work on Red-Headed Woman with Marcel Desano in 1931, which did not end well for Fitzgerald. So his idea of like, oh yeah, just team up with somebody, no, leave me alone. But it was different now because now he had to play ball. He was out of money. He was desperate. So they stick him in a room with a writer. He has to deal with it. Too bad, baby. Too bad, baby. You're not my baby. You're a baby. Anywho, baby.
Listen up, baby. I'm F. Scott Fitzgerald. The Great Gatsby, baby.
They were paying him really well. He was placed between the 83rd and 91st percentile at MGM. Out of 228 writers, not more than a maximum of 18 were paid as well as he was. And almost right away, he begins to pay back his debts to Ober, his agent, which was very decent of him. He gives some money back to Perkins as well. The remaining 400 went to his living expenses, which included taking care of his daughter, who was going to Vassar, monthly hospital bills for Zelda. He was not drinking at the time. He was living incredibly frugally, driving around in a secondhand Ford, which was way beneath his stature.
I just can't imagine. It's so weird.
It is.
F. Scott Fitzgerald driving around in a secondhand Ford.
Waiting
down Culver Boulevard.
Waiting at a red light.
Waiting at a red light. Wishing it was green, just like the light at the dock of Daisy's.
I read enough Cliff Notes to get that.
Oh, the Cliff Notes are beautiful.
God, whoever wrote those Cliff Notes is fantastic.
G. Scott Fitzgerald.
Zelda Fitzgerald. So the money he was getting was just putting out fires. He was keeping himself afloat. As well as they were paying him, it was just keeping him along. So things were looking good, and he had to now deliver the goods, which, oh boy. So during his year and a half at MGM, Scott was assigned to a total of 6 different projects. Of these 6, one was a partial rewriting job of another MGM writer's original script called A Yank at Oxford, which, knowing F. Scott Fitzgerald, he seems like he fit into that one based on the title alone. It was mostly just patchwork for that job. 4 of the projects resulted in his writing screenplays based on the literary works of other writers, the titles of these being Three Comrades, Infidelity, The Women, and Madame Cruz. The last assignment only lasted a few days. That was Marie Antoinette, and from there he was sent to work on The Women. With the exception of The Women, all the films he worked on were eventually produced, but Scott only received writing credit for his work on The Three Comrades, one of 6. For A Yank at Oxford, he was hired to add what the artist calls a collegiate gloss to the story of a young man who arrives at Oxford University and is instantly disliked by the other students for his American brashness. The story also involves 2 lovely ladies played by Vivian Leigh and Maureen O'Sullivan. Fitzgerald decided to touch up the characterization.
Psycho?
No, that's Janet Leigh.
Oh.
Close. Vivian Leigh is Gone with the Wind.
Oh, Mammy?
She was Mammy, yeah.
This
is a story of a young man who goes to school in Oxford and Mammy's there.
Frankly, my dear, I don't give a damn about an Oxford comma.
Fitzgerald decided to touch up the characterization of female characters and started by improving upon the dialogue, which if he showed a comparison of before and after Fitzgerald touched it up, it was improved a lot in the sort of Fitzgerald way. He spent about 3 weeks on this, and some of the original dialogue can still be heard in the film, but he received, like I said, no credit for his touch-up work. But he got paid, and he had a delightful lunch with Maureen O'Sullivan, so... there you go. Some experiences were just not as good as others, but that was fine. Next up was The Three Comrades, which he was assigned to in August of 1937. But for this project came one of Fitzgerald's worst experiences working in our city. One of the reasons he didn't like to work with other writers was that he liked total control of what he worked on. He had it when he created his masterpiece literary work, but now in this new medium, he struggled to get the final say in anything. In all, Fitzgerald's...
that Spielberg deal.
If Jurassic Park was on my table, it would have been all different.
The Great Tyrannosaurus Rex.
I wrote the line, kill her. Guy comes on the screen and says, shoot her. What's that?
Oh, I say. That's
You're all over the map on that one.
That's a New Englander saying the only thing I think anyone outside of California says, which is, I say.
In all, Fitzgerald spent 6 months writing a total of 7 different versions of his script for Three Comrades for Joseph Mankiewicz, who Fitzgerald referred to as Monkey Bitch. Which is subpar coming from a literary titan, but in a way...
he really did lose his edge. The Great Gatsby, or Monkey Bitch.
It's almost funnier coming from him, just being so childish and vulgar. Monkey Bitch.
You know what I call that guy there? Stink Nose.
It looks like his nose stinks. Winter Dreams is one of my favorite things, but here he is like snickers, like, Monkey Bitch, so you're gonna tell me what I'm gonna write with literary lines I want. He cared very little for Mankiewicz, who would later go on to win an Oscar for the screenplay and direction of All About Eve in 1950. Look at that. Picked a powerful enemy, buddy. Fitzgerald wrote a treatment for The Three Comrades and was given the go-ahead to complete the final shooting script by himself, which he finished by September. After reading the first draft, however, Mankiewicz was seeing that Fitzgerald was going to need a lot of help. For a story regarding 3 young veterans of World War I in the early 1920s, Fitzgerald was adding scenes including St. Peter at the pearly gates and some other out-of-place little moments like that.
It's weird that he and Faulkner had these like weird postmodern thing with like apostles and saints.
Yeah, and they both had to do with World War I, which they're both fascinated with.
Very strange.
Very strange, guys. It was new, like writing for movies was new, and they thought, oh, he wrote a great novel. He's going to do such a fantastic job, but it's different.
You know who would have written great screenplays? Dostoevsky.
By the middle of October, they assigned him a collaborator. Luckily, it was an old New York acquaintance of Fitzgerald named E.E. Paramore, so there was less hostility, but not really. They ended up getting into verbal arguments within the week, both trying to impress Monkey Bitch with 2 very different ideas of the story. Scott was always adventuresome with the screenplay, and Paramore wanted to keep it safe because safe sells.
Safe sells.
Safe sells.
That's the hot motto.
For the 30s. Yeah. Safe sells.
And then in the 60s, that all changed.
He considered his work on The Three Comrades to be good, and he took it very seriously, and he was getting really frustrated with Monkey Bitch anytime that he tried to take his script apart. He rewrote much of the...
As a monkey bitch does.
As a monkey bitch. You leave a monkey bitch with a script, you watch what happens. Just like a monkey to go ahead and rip something apart.
You know, if you leave an infinite amount of monkey bitches in a room, eventually they'll type out the script for All About Eve. By the way, we don't condone the nickname Monkey Bitch.
No, I know. I'm not saying that was a good thing to call anybody.
No.
But it's funny.
Not even a monkey. They know. They feel.
Know. Yeah.
They've got thumbs. They can feel.
In all honesty, monkey hands freak the hell out of me. Orangutan hands really scare me. I'm being honest.
Orangutan?
Orangutan
Hans?
That's the name of the Star Wars character, right? Orangutan Hans. Monkey Bitch was rewriting a lot of the dialogue that Fitzgerald was putting down, and Fitzgerald held his dialogue to be sacred. But Mankiewicz claimed that Fitzgerald was a great novelist, sure, but he couldn't put down decent dialogue on the screen. His words were better.
That seems to be their
problem. Yeah, I imagine that they were both very dramatic, and they wanted you to.
Their scene descriptions must have been beautiful.
We can't afford this.
The way he writes cut too.
His words, as Mankiewicz was saying, were better for reading than speaking. Although he thought film was inferior medium compared to literature, he still was a fan of motion pictures. He decided to give himself a crash course in screenwriting by watching dozens of MGM's greatest movies they had of the previous 15 years, and then typing up hundreds of these little file cards containing plot lines of all the successful films they put out. It's a smart approach, it really is. But there's a certain amount of arrogance to that as well. Like the idea that you can break it down and synthesize it and hope to produce something natural when really what you're doing is very unnatural, especially if you're so used to writing novels that probably, I mean, I'm sure there's a structure to it, but to like look at a movie, like look at a bunch of movies and like every one of them does this. Like that's Sid Field's stuff.
Yeah, that's film school.
How am I gonna make $1 million?
So F. Scott Fitzgerald invented film school.
He invented film school. He wasn't looking at the greatest films of MGM, just the biggest hits, which is a really shrewd way of making money. The fighting was intensifying, but Fitzgerald, needing to keep himself employed, tried to keep it as civil as possible, which meant instead of screaming, he was writing really passive-aggressive letters and sending them out.
Leaving notes on the refrigerator.
You're gonna need to stop changing. Oh my God. The tension led him back to drinking, of course, and there were a few episodes where he was too drunk to make it to work, but he still, even that, managed to keep his job, although Monkey Bitch did take note of, oh, he's drunk again, he can't come in. Also, Fitzgerald getting drunk, playing with fire. he was one of those people. It's fascinating reading this because I drink from time to time. I know a lot of people.
Whoa, this is a family program here.
I've known people.
He means chocolate milk. Come on, everybody.
His tummy is full with chocolate milk.
Dripping out of his nose. That's blood. You wipe your nose.
It's all that coke we were doing off the hands of Bullwinkle. Are we keeping that in?
I don't even remember what episode that's from. Refer to episode Monsters for that one.
It's fascinating that he would drink himself to be hospitalized. That's something that, like, wow, that's insane.
Very unhealthy behavior.
Yeah, that is insane. I know people do it. I just, like... So, October, they brought Paramore in. The boys keep rewriting the script, and
The band?
Yeah, the band Paramore. Oh my God, I just realized that right now. He's got to change his name.
Let's call him Stinknose. Again.
That's what he meant by Paramore. They kept rewriting the script, and then Mankiewicz kept sending it back to them. No, it's not good enough. And by January, Mankiewicz was tired of rejecting them, so he made his own drastic reworking of The Three Comrades, and it was set to shoot in early February of 1938. Fitzgerald was not happy about this at all. He wrote a letter to Monkey Bitch, which I don't think he referred to him to his... Time. He obviously didn't refer to Mankiewicz as Monkey Bitch to his face, but he pretty much, in his tone of voice, you could tell he was calling him Monkey Bitch. He told him that if he moved forward with this script, it would be a box office disaster, and he was dead wrong. The picture opened to very favorable reviews. It was selected as one of the 10 best pictures of that year.
They did that sort of thing back then?
They only had 10 pictures. That was the 10th picture they ever made.
Was Birdman on that list?
Yeah, but it was the cartoon. Referred to episode Monsters. It was a success at the time at the box office, and Mankiewicz was very, very pleased, mostly because he got to gloat about it. And upon viewing the final cut of the film, Fitzgerald was filled, of course, anger, of course, frustration, slumping. Apparently, he went to...
And alcohol.
And the alcohol helps you slump in the chair. He was sitting in the theaters, just slumped in his chair as deep as possible. He took it very badly.
With a laser pointer.
Stupid nose. But you didn't
Stupid stink nose.
Stupid stink nose. And
you're all stink nose to me. If you're not a stink nose, you're a monkey bitch.
Look how bad this picture is. A little red dot everywhere. Who wrote this? After all the craziness that goes through, Fitzgerald's name appears only in the credits for this movie. This is the only one he gets credit as screenwriter for. Awesome. After all of that insanity he had to go through. Also, because of The Three Comrades, his option was picked up by the studio, and his weekly salary was raised to $12.50 a week.
He's the champion now.
Yeah, he's champion.
You know how much Wyatt Earp was making a week? $70.
Faulkner was kicked down to $300 a week. $300 a week, and he had 3 families to take care of, and here's F. Scott
per family.
So next up was a movie called Infidelity, which Scott was hired to make the material interesting enough to last 75 minutes of a movie, and yet tame enough not to bother the censors, which were having the field day in the 30s.
Safe cells.
And think of the title itself, Infidelity. Safe cells. It involves a woman whose husband has cheated on her once with his secretary, and after discussing divorce, she ends up forgiving him, and the happy endings ensue. The studio was pushing for Joan Crawford.
A real feminist movie.
Look, he messed up once, but if you ever do it, you're going to be in the ground. That was dialogue from the movie. The studio was pushing for Joan Crawford, so Scott screened 3 of her biggest movies, Chained, Possessed, and Forsaking All Others, and began to break down the films analytically, dividing them into acts and scenes, and examining the dramatic structure. He was really good at this. After this, he created a dramatic plan showing how all the acts and sequences would play out according to this plan. It was very mechanized, and he was getting a really good idea of how it was all working as a whole, how you can take scenes and build it up to a screenplay. So he was getting better. He was really serious about this project as well. He was able to work alone on it, which was really awesome, but he was still going through revisions because he himself was very unsatisfied with his own work. He knew he wasn't a great screenwriter at this point, and it wasn't coming out to his satisfaction. He continued revising the script through the spring of 1938 with the impossible task of creating a box office success while getting the approval of the official production code of the 30s, those prudes. And with the subject of adultery, it was already a hard balancing act for him.
Also, production code, you might want to refer to episode Monsters to learn a little bit more about that.
None of his revisions or anything mattered. Fitzgerald was taken off the project that May after the board decided that the very theme of the movie was too risque. They even attempted to change the title of the movie to Fidelity. No dice. So it was a great disappointment to Fitzgerald and the producer that Scott couldn't.
Just rename it Christian Values.
The entire writing process for this, which he did take seriously, it was really disappointing that it didn't go through. And he also had a producer on that who he was trying to impress, and he was really looking forward to Fitzgerald knocking something out, and he was really disappointed that Fitzgerald kept revising, but it didn't matter anyway, so I don't know what the result been out of shape for. He worked a week on Marie Antoinette, and there's very little to say about this experience other than it sent him to work on The Women, which he worked on in May of 1938. A little earlier that year with the same producer of Infidelity. The same sort of problems were arising from Infidelity. Fitzgerald had to please the producer, and even with a writing collaborator that was brought on board for the project, they were finding it both impossible. The producer, Hunt Stromberg, was constantly changing his mind about the direction that the writers should move forward. And they made a remake recently. I forget who's in it. But it's a cast of all women. A lot of talking.
Ghostbusters?
It's Ghostbusters. All women Ghostbusters. I hope that's the title of the new Ghostbusters. All women Ghostbusters.
Women welcome. Ghostbusters, colon. Now hiring.
Subtitle, tell them about the Twinkie. So after about 4 months of writing and rewriting The Women, Stromberg never seemed satisfied, and Fitzgerald was taken off the project, and that's when he begins to work on something called Madame Cruz, which was simply to stick him somewhere. They were just waiting out his contract with MGM at this point, so just make him do something. Halfway through the script of Madame Cruz at Christmas, he was abruptly informed that his contract was not going to be renewed. Bummer. He had been fired after 18 months and now was back into panic mode. There's two reasons why Fitzgerald was let go from his contract. First was economic, as they learned that he was good, but not that good. He hadn't really produced a lot. He didn't get his name around. He hadn't put anything out there that was Fitzgerald's work. The other was based on his drinking, which was somewhat speculative, somewhat fact. He didn't drink very much while he was employed at MGM, but when he did, it was a complete disaster, costing him nothing more than just time away from his job. So now Fitzgerald had to find writing work outside of MGM. He left Madame Cruz and was picked up by David O. Selznick, big name, to do some quick last-minute work on Gone with the Wind. He wasn't writing necessarily... With Mammy, starring Mammy. He wasn't writing necessarily. What he was really doing was just polishing dialogue.
What year was Gone with the Wind?
Sometime before 1939, 1938-ish.
And they of the two great American writers, they chose the one not from the South to help with the realistic dialogue in Gone with the Wind.
I'm pretty sure nobody wanted to bother Faulkner. He's just sitting in his shorts by a typewriter like, Mr. Faulkner,
that's where they got the line, I don't give a damn. It was Faulkner's response to their queries.
They had to add quite frankly later.
They cleaned it up.
February 1939, Fitzgerald hires a couple agents to help him become a freelance screenwriter. He found a job working on a Walter Wagner production called Winter Carnival. His asking price was $1,500 per week, which he got.
God, he's just up in the ante.
Well, it's Fitzgerald. This was another college romance story, so it was right up Fitzgerald's alley. However, his time on the project turned into, like I said, a complete nightmare, and it tarnished his reputation for his years of Hollywood work after that. Wagner had hired a Dartmouth alumnus named Bud Schulberg to pin
What makes Sammy run?
They hired him to work with F. Scott Fitzgerald. Remind me how F. Scott Fitzgerald likes to work with other people?
Oh, he loves it.
He loves it, especially when it's
collaboration was his motto. And drinking was his vice.
So Wagner, Schulberg, and Fitzgerald fly out to Dartmouth to experience an actual winter carnival, full camera crew and everything. So Fitzgerald starts drinking on his plane ride heading east, and he, in typical jazz age fashion, gets drunk off his ass. He continued that one-man party with little breaks of sobriety for 10 days. There were several, quote...
The jazz aid was over. Get over it. F. Scott.
We're in the bebop days. It's heroin or nothing. Heroin or bust. So there were a lot of incidents. Scott was often moments from collapsing. Wagner, for his credit, put up with a lot of this behavior, but eventually fired both Fitzgerald and Schulberg and sent them to New York. On the train ride to New York.
New York City.
On the train ride to New York City, Schulberg took full responsibility for Fitzgerald that he could no longer take responsibility for himself. And to top it off, it was seeming like Scott was suffering from pneumonia, Winter Carnival. And with the help of his lady friend back in LA, Sheila Graham, they were able to admit him to a hospital to treat everything. He spent a week there, and Schulberg was rehired by Wagner to complete the script. But Schulberg wrote a novel titled The Disenchanted. It was published a decade later, and it tells the story of Manly Halliday, a thinly veiled representation of F. Scott Fitzgerald, who in the novel is a man who lacks all personal dignity, a once charismatic and talented man who has fallen into pieces. This and many other accounts cemented the idea of Fitzgerald in Hollywood, which was the image of a washed-up, suicidally alcoholic shadow of his former self. So his image was completely tarnished. Try to get in a job in Hollywood after they know that if they hire you, you're going to get drunk for 10 days and have to go to a hospital. It's 1939. The whole Dartmouth Winter Carnival thing was a total train wreck, and it cost Fitzgerald a lot. Not only financially, since doctors and hospital time aren't free and you aren't a writer if every inch of tissue is soaked in gin, but also spiritually. His good streak was over now. He no longer had a regular job, so he would slip into long drinking binges. He'd just end up at hospitals. He kept ending up in hospitals. Summer of 1939 was so gloomy for Fitzgerald and Graham, and she was convinced that he was trying to kill himself, which he probably was. He would have if it wasn't for her constant care. His depression was justified, really. He was responsible for tarnishing his own reputation. His behavior in New Hampshire had gone around, and people were reluctant to hire him. He drank himself out of a job, basically.
And into our hearts.
Where we keep him in a little flask. He took a very ill-advised trip to North Carolina, got Zelda, who they let out on a brief holiday, and then they went to Cuba.
Oh, God.
And once again, he began to drink in an old jazz-aid fashion. From all accounts, the entire Cuba trip was a disaster. He had gone to a really vicious fight.
They ran out of mojitos.
Hemingway was there. He drank all of them. Hemingway was here, wasn't he?
Hemingway! Ernie! Damn it, Ernie!
He gets into a really vicious fight in Havana, and then he gets back to the States, another one in New York with a cab driver. He later collapsed at the Algonquin Hotel, completely exhausted. So Zelda had to admit him to the doctor's hospital where he had to stay for 2 weeks. This was the last time that Zelda and Scott saw each other.
What a fitting goodbye for both of them.
You're having a breakdown. I got to go continue my breakdown. It's been nice. It's been nice playing Splendor in the Grass with you.
Mental institution. Have fun lying on this pool table.
That's what she said, Abbott. Kidding. After this,
check back to
episode monsters. After this whole thing, he returns to California, and he's forced to remain in bed for several more weeks. It's some months before he's able to attempt working again. He picked up a single week's work at Universal. His money problems were mounting once again, and he turned to his short story writing, which he hadn't touched in a year. All of his 9 published titles were still in print. Their total sales in 1939 came out to 114 copies. Royalties cashing it at $33.
Oh my God.
Double digits.
Was it 33 cents also, just to...
Palindrome thing?
Yeah.
It was 33 cents.
He gets paid in palindromes. What I just said was a palindrome.
As he was recovering, he slowly became a different type of social being. Once a man who shuffled lightly from extravagant party to extravagant party, he was now content to just sit around a room with friends and entertain or be entertained in small groups. Sheila and Scott, before all of this, were living in somewhere called the Garden of Allah. It was off of Sunset Boulevard and now a parking lot. It was once a very lavishly exotic...
the parking lot of Allah.
It was built by a 20s film star named Alla Nazimova. It was very lavishly exotic. A lot of writers stayed there. A lot of drunks stayed there. So around this time, 1938, she decides to leave this place because it's probably bad influence. She had a beach house in Malibu that she was renting. I couldn't find the address, but the conditions in the winter were lacking the charm they sought. So they ended up in the fall of 1938 renting a house in Encino, the former estate of comic actor Edward Everett Horton. Do you know who he was?
The Horton who heard the Who?
Mm-hmm. You're wrong. He actually narrated Fractured Fairy Tales of Rocky and Bullwinkle show.
Oh my God.
The narrator.
Wow. We did a bunch of blow off of them. Also, refer back to episode Monsters to learn a little bit more about that. That's weird.
It's really weird. He was in the 40s, the honorary governor of the Valley.
Wow.
Yeah. Check
F.
that
Scott
out.
Fitzgerald?
No, I don't like you. This estate of Mr. Horton's was called Valley Acres, 5521 Amsoy Avenue, now, according to Google, part of the 101 freeway. But they did name a street after him. And if you've driven around, you recognize the name. Edward Everett Horton is off of Burbank Boulevard. I believe it's by Balboa, I think. Oh, and one of the guests at the cottage after the Fitzgeralds was Vivian Vance, or as we know her, Ethel Mertz.
Oh my God.
Check that out. Back to business. Fitzgerald's recuperating. They stayed at Ballyacres, with the name he hated, by the way, for 18 months. After Encino, they stayed in a small apartment off of North Laurel in Hollywood, because she still worked in Hollywood, so they had to be close to that. He was beginning to go out again. He would go to Musso and Frank's, popular among alcoholic writers.
And cowboys.
Wyatt Earp was there. William Faulkner was there. Raymond Chandler was there. Fitzgerald was writing short stories again, but they weren't getting picked up, so he was coming short on money again. He began wiring his old ATM, Harold Ober, his literary agent, for money. Ober paid him once. Upon Fitzgerald's second request, for the first time ever, Ober denied him. He didn't want to start another lending spree with Fitzgerald because they'd gone on forever, and he didn't want to have to rely on that. So that professional relationship was over, and it was a friendship over. Realizing now that he couldn't rely on Ober to front him the money, he understood that now he was completely on his own and had to rely on himself to bring in money, like an adult. He managed to get a job at 20th Century Fox, but it only lasted a day since it was just coming up with ideas for an ice skating picture. He hustled a job from Sam Goldwyn to rewrite a script called Raffles, but the producer and the director got into a fight, and Fitzgerald's services were no longer needed after that. Look at him staying out of a fight. March of 1940, he managed to write some serials for Esquire, paying him about $250 per story, which ran a little over a year. They weren't really good, and he knew it. They referred to as the Pat Hobby stories. They're kind of autobiographical, but it was just survival. Also in 1940, he managed to sell the rights to one of his best stories, Babylon Revisited. He sold it to Republic Studios, the lowest of the low, he called them.
Studio City.
For $800. One of his best stories he sold for $800.
Have I told you about the parking lot at Republic Studios?
Mwah.
Beautiful.
If you're going to have your car seen anywhere in this town, you have your car seen at the Republic Studios parking lot. Yeah. But he also managed to wrangle up a $300 a week paycheck working on a screenplay, so good for him.
Demoted, though.
The story makes for a great short story, but the idea that it could be turned into a full-length feature seemed really improbable, and before long, the crux of the story got away from them. Fitzgerald began adding cliches, hoping that it could sell easier, and after a while, the story was out of Wall Street, millions of dollars lost, paid assassins, Shirley Temple got involved, and the script took another mutation.
The most dangerous of all, paid assassins.
Paid assassins like Shirley Temple.
Now I can do my impression of William Faulkner singing Animal Crackers in my soup.
You were just waiting this whole time.
Animal crackers, I say in my soup.
From this, he spent the better part of a July day in the company of 12-year-old Shirley Temple, attempting to convince her and her mother to do the project, knowing that it would land a deal easier if she was attached to it. She didn't, and the project took a hit. It wasn't until 1954 when MGM bought the rights for $100,000, which they rewrote the script Fitzgerald had written for it, and it became The Last Time I Saw Paris with Elizabeth Taylor and Van Johnson. This was a long time after he died. He gets a few more meager jobs around some studios and manages to survive, but his career as a screenwriter has accumulated to nothing significant. For his last film assignment, Light of Heart, his screenplay was considered unacceptable and later rewritten as Life Begins at 8:30. But it didn't matter. He took the $7,000 for it. Fine, whatever. With that, though, he turned back to literature and began to work on his final novel, The Last Tycoon, which is regarded as one of his best. If there's any doubt that Hollywood had drained F. Scott Fitzgerald of his talent, The Last Tycoon was proof that he still had it in him. It is seen as one of his best works. He had processed the studio system and could effectively comment on it, which was really important. The novel, however, is unfinished because Fitzgerald died before he could close it off. He died of a heart attack December 21st, 1940, in Sheila Graham's apartment. Didn't end well for him. Well, it kind of did.
Nothing ends well for anybody.
No.
Gotta tell you, most people die.
How?
Heart attacks in Sheila E.'s apartment. Whatever you say.
If you look at these two examples of men who came to Hollywood to work to simply make money, it took a lot out of them. Faulkner was able to walk away from it. F. Scott died here, but he was working on his novel. They both went back to literature, but Hollywood had drained a certain element of their, I don't want to say creativity. It seemed to take a real innocence out of them. It showed them that there was other writing, other art medium happening that they could not be involved in, that they took serious ego hits with.
Hollywood is a character from a Todd Browning movie.